People make fun of the red deck. It's the deck you buy when you're on a budget. A handful of basic mountains and whatever commons attack for 2. It's the deck you play at a tournament if you want to hang out with your friends and snack all day because either you win fast or you lose the game real quick. It's the pile of cards you hand to a new player because even bad Magic players can sneak in a win with it, and it's pretty controversial, but many people say it's the easiest deck to pilot. But it's also the archetype that has top-8'd the most amount of Pro Tours and World Championships, piloted by the most talented people to ever cast spells. It's a really awkward question to ask, but is the cheapest deck in Magic the Gathering also the best deck? Let's go back in time.
And that's going to do it. Wyatt Darby is your Pro Tour Dominaria champion in an unlikely comeback in game number 5.
The game has had a World Championships every year since 1994. For context, the series is about as old as Harry Styles. And red aggro decks have existed since 1995. For reference, that's about as old as the first Toy Story. But it still came 7th at the World Championships that year. And it still top-8'd Worlds in the hands of Chris Bakula just 2 years later. And then it still went on winning and top-8'ing Worlds and top-8'ing Worlds 12 more times.
Is going to force the game, and that's it. Javier Dominguez with a lightning fast victory here in game number 2. Not much to be said about that one. Dominguez just smashed him.
This deck wins so much that the colloquial name that Magic players call it by is Red Deck Wins. But why? Why is the deck that's usually just a pile of bad cards win so much? What even is a Red Deck Wins?
Well, a Red Deck Wins is obviously a red deck that wins.
I couldn't answer this on my own, so I asked the fervent champion himself.
I'm Javier Dominguez, 2018 World Champion and former MPL competitor. I'm also a co-host of Competitive Magic with the Cardmarket.
But before Javier helps me delve into the wild past of what made Magic players turn on that red light and the weird path they took to get there, please. I spent an absurd amount of hours and resources researching this for you all. The kindest way you can thank me is by clicking that sub button. It's free, costs you nothing, and if you're already subbed, no problem. Next time someone tells you Mono Red is for noobs, just point them to this video and to Javier's podcast. It's delightful, and there's Andrea Mengucci in it. If you're new to Magic, players generally divide the different types of decks you can play into a few solid archetypes. The main 3 are Control, Combo, and Aggro. Control tries to slow down the pace of the game by destroying creatures and countering spells to bridge the match into the later stages of the game where they can leverage drawing more cards and playing higher mana cost spells.
I feel like if you're Wafo, you say, okay, I've got counters, you've got counters, I don't need to do anything, but you do. How about I let you make the first move so I can cast the first counter spell?
Combo tends to set up their deck and board presence to win in one single turn, snap, by landing a combination of cards that end the game immediately.
Any more dice anywhere? There's the handshake! There you go, Stanislav Sivka is the Pro Tour champion.
Aggro, on the other hand, takes a whole other angle, like a shuttle burning all of its fuel and discarding its rockets just to get to atmosphere, and then let Throttle take it from there. Aggro decks tend to play cheap spells so they can cast as many of them as they can. Instead of overpowering your opponent, you're trying to get under them and simply finishing the game before they can take it over themselves with their more powerful cards. The best aggro decks don't just swing at their opponents like knuckleheads, they attack from 2 angles, reducing their opponent's life total with their creatures to then end the game on the stack.
You can divide most Magic decks in these 2 axes, like decks that beat you through the battlefield and decks that beat you through the stack.
The stack is this special realm of Magic where cards exist when they're not yet on the battlefield. If you've been cast and you're not yet a permanent on the battlefield, put Google Maps away, I know exactly where you are, you're on the stack.
Counter spells interact with the stack, and discard spells sort of interact with the stack, but removals interact with the battlefield. Rec decks are often structured in 2 angles, like the battlefield angle and the stack angle. Some red decks are full of creatures that are trying to dominate the battlefield and just deal all the damage through that, and some decks are just full of burn spells, like some even are like completely only burn spells and they just win through the stack. Like every deck has its balance and depends on the format, but overall it tends to be a mix of those.
And the best aggro decks are the ones that can work with both of those areas of the game of Magic. When an opponent packs removal spells against your creatures, you can end the game using the stack by pointing lightning bolts at their life total. But if your opponent has counter spells for your burn, you can just turn the creatures you already played sideways. There's also other archetypes like mid-range and aggro control, but we can talk about those if we ever get enough traction on this kind of content to move to other archetypes. But first, let's go back in time to the Wild West of Magic. Richard Garfield presented the game to the world at Gen Con in 1993. It was the most talked about product at the event, and they sold out all the products they brought. People would be sitting in the hallways on the floor playing with starter decks that they threw a few booster packs in. When they came back from Gen Con, they had so many orders that their fax machine broke. They sold out Alpha within a week, laying out all the booster boxes for Alpha into the backyard in separate piles for each distributor. If it rained that night, that's it. No Alpha. The first ever Magic the Gathering tournament was held at that convention. We don't have the deck list, but we know that someone called Alex Parrish, playing a deck containing Terror and an Holy Strength, defeated a Rick Townsend in the finals. He was playing a Selesnya deck containing Giant Spider, Circle of Protection Red, and Script Sprites. If I could go back in time from today, I'd absolutely crush that tournament with a deck with 20 Black Lotus, 19 Ancestral Recall, and 1 Fireball. Easy game, noobs. But the point that I want to get to is that decks were kind of clunky back then, and the strategies we rely on today had not yet been conceived. To help us look into how Mono Red first came in and dropped the mic onto the battlefield, I called up our favorite Magic historian and the head of Insight article section on Cardmarket, Toby.
Our story begins in 1996 because tournaments, as we now know, didn't really exist before 1996. 1996 had the first Pro Tour. For that one, you qualified by calling a hotline, whereas after that event, Pro Tour qualifiers started in a big way. Even in the US, there were 2 slot qualifiers where people showed up, and the first 2 got an invite to the next event.
The format at the time was Type 2, now called Standard, where you can only play cards from the most recent sets. This included 4th edition, Homelands, Fallen Empires, Ice Age, Chronicles. Thing is,
those sets are not famous for being the most high-powered, especially when it comes to aggressive strategies. Like, the creatures during that time were horrendous, really.
To make up for this, players looked to go bigger with their strategies, and Necropotence was right by the phone ready to answer that call. Yeah, hello? Oh, Necropotence. Yeah. I need you.
Tournament Magic is often marked by like one super dominant deck, and that we already had in 1996 as well, known as the Necro Summer, because Necropotence was everywhere, like with Dark Ritual, Hymn to Durek, Hypnotic Spectre.
Creatures were not what they are now. Some of the strongest creatures in the deck were the 2-mana Pump Knights.
Those were great because they had protection from white, and Swords to Plowshares was the best removal spell commonly known, but they weren't very good at fighting against red cards. And that is exactly where this brand new deck came in that is largely credited with the invention of even using something like a mana curve.
The discovery of the mana curve in the game of Magic was one of the pivotal steps in technological advances in game theory, just like the discovery of fire. It goes like this. In Magic, the best way to maximize the efficiency of your strategy is usually to make sure that you use all your resources on every turn. If you end your turn cycle with even 1 untapped mana pip, that is a wasted resource. Where's Opt when you want it? A player called Jay Schneider discovered that if you had about 9 1-mana spells, then 15 at 2 mana, 11 at 3, and to go down at a similar percentage, you can maximize your chances of using every resource you have available on each of your turns.
If you look at the color pie, there are different things different colors can do. Red has a lot of hidden card advantage. If you think about a deck that attacks the battlefield, it's easy to think that if you kill an opponent with cards in hand, that's card advantage because they never got to play the cards.
It's an obvious concept now, but Schneider realized that if you play out your cards faster than your opponent can, even if you end the game with 0 cards in your hand and they have a full stack, if they never manage to play them, it's theoretically like just having drawn 4 or 5 more cards in a regular game.
If there's a situation where the red player is ahead and they have the battlefield under control, and the opponent cannot play their optimal play because they will lose to a red spell, that's also card advantage.
That was a huge deal at the time because people hadn't figured that out, because there was so much other powerful stuff that you could do instead, and Jay Schneider did, and that is like probably his biggest contribution to Magic theory, and it's commonly known by the name Sligh.
This round consisted of 4 games, all involving the quick mono-red Sligh deck against the slow-controlling recurring Nightmare deck. Chris Bakula showed great skill with Sligh, winning the first game.
Although the deck was designed by Jay Schneider, his friend Paul Sligh took 2nd place at the 1996 World Championships with it.
But the name Sligh somehow just stuck. So for years after that, people were still referring to any aggressive red deck as a Sligh deck.
That you won an IQ with, and that's Boss Sligh.
We know at least for sure that they did in 1997 at the US National.
Claim to the title of US National Champion.
Both players had variations of Sligh decks. The match went
The format was still standard, but they no longer had any weird restricted cards. This is not Yu-Gi-Oh! The new hot set to enter Type 2 was Mirage.
Mirage block had some good cards, and that is where we first meet David Price, who became a Magic legend with his modified Sligh deck, as it was called at the time.
As David Price, considered by many to be the premier Sligh player, took the match 3-0.
In the first semifinal are two fast decks, one red, one white. Dave Price is playing his signature deck, Dead Guy Red. Original Sligh focused on mana curve and card flexibility, but Price's deck is simply about doing 20 points of damage.
The deck went by both Modified Sligh and Dead Guy Red because this is a time where Magic players were whimsical and would name their decks after things like breakfast cereal or sandwiches or, well, mostly food. Dead Guy was the name of a team of notable Magic players.
Probably the most famous person on that team that people know nowadays is Chris Pikula.
The team also created the deck Dead Guy Ale, which is still around today. Once again, it's a food name. Anyways, Price's deck is relevant because it began the trend of the turn 4 deck. This set the pace for aggro decks aiming to end the game by turn 4, starting off the game with 7 1-drops and 4 tap lands.
11 things to do on turn 1, but those 1-drops, Goblin Vandal and Goblin Digging Team, at least had some relevant ability. One could destroy artifacts, the other could destroy a wall.
Make fun of that wall thing all you want, but Wall of Roots was one of the strongest creatures those days. For power comparison, the best 2-drop Price could find was Iron Claw Orcs, which is quite painfully a grizzly bear with a downside. But Price also packed some heavy weapons.
4 copies of Ball Lightning, which is a one-shot effect that will, in all likelihood, just deal 6 to the opponent. Also, Viashino's Sandstalker.
This and 4 Lava Hounds meant that as soon as Price would hit turn 3 or 4, he could start pumping out huge flurries of damage. It would cost him life, he would have to sacrifice his creatures, but Price was not planning on the game going long enough for that to matter. The strategy was really proving its power.
Yeah, David Price went 6-0 in Standard that year, but since that was a mixed format tournament, draft and standard,
Next game.
he sadly didn't make the top 8.
Okay, so Lindy goes up 2-0.
The thing I need to drive home about the turn 4 decks is that they live in this special space that doesn't really care much about their opponent.
Result hinges on Tom's hand a lot more than Ben's. It seems like if Tom has a good enough draw, he's almost playing against a brick wall.
Right.
You could take this very same deck against a deck from today, and if they stumble on mana or develop their game plan too slowly, if they take longer than turn 4, they could just succumb to this ancient pile of cardboard.
It's still, you could play it today and it would run very smoothly. The cards are a little dated, especially the 1-drops, of course, and well, most of the drops, but it is a high-functioning deck that just runs like a well-oiled machine. So this is how David Price first made a name for himself as the king of Beatdown, but this was just before the release of Tempest. And Tempest obviously was a huge game changer for every aggressive deck, but red decks in particular.
Showing the sheer power of the deck and of David Price himself, he won the Pro Tour that year with the same deck, except packed with Tempest cards. I'll let the stock, tough, disembodied TV voice tell you what the deck does.
Sligh is a red deck built around the principle of speed. Sligh's strategy is to strike early and often with a combination of small creature and spell cards in an attempt to inflict damage quickly. Early game, a player casts many small creatures and spells, such as Mog Fanatic, Jackal Pup, and Shock.
Magic the Gathering is very cool. It seemed like Wizard staff at the time were card-carrying members of the Sligh party because they decided that the Pro Tour that year would only allow players to play cards from the Tempest set.
So the only cards you could use were from Tempest, but you could actually bring a pretty decent deck because Tempest had so much for red cards. It had the famous Jackal Pup.
Now, Gen Z nowadays might look at this 1-mana 2/1 that deals you damage and say something like, big yikes. But 90s kids remember that this was the first 2-power 1-drop at a pivotal point for aggro. You could play it in Cube, goddammit. Mog Conscripts was also released that year, but yeah, it's kind of like the Zoolander 2 to Jackal Pup. But like Zoolander 2, it still dealt damage, so. Anyway, this deck never wasted any mana because it had 16 1-drop creatures and 8 2-drop creatures.
And it would empty its hand so fast because it wanted to get Curse Scroll online.
Curse Scroll.
The card of the tournament.
Most played creatures at the time didn't have more than 2 toughness, so Curse Scroll could just mow down a board, sniping all the creatures out as long as you had only 1 card in hand.
It actually did something to combat that as well. For instance, it would put Giant Strength, which is an enchantment that gives enchanted creature +2/+2.
David actually won a game against an opponent with a scroll by just suiting up one of his 2-drops with a giant strength.
In Tempest only, you had Kindle and you had Curse Scroll, but those only deal 2. So if you had like a Jackal-Pup and put a giant strength on that, you were at a huge lead.
It's unkillable! It's a 4/3!
Yeah, like there was this story, like this urban legend going around of someone going to to this Pro Tour with a deck with 22 planes, 4 disenchant and 4 Curse Scroll, and then just aggressively mulliganing down to Curse Scroll, because Curse Scroll you would be guaranteed that way to have Curse Scroll active on turn 3. That apparently didn't really happen, but it was an urban legend that persisted for some time.
The fact that this was even a rumor that was considered possible goes to show the strength of the card. But that was it. The pup was out of the bag. Sligh was no longer a secret, and at the World Championships that year, Mono Red had 3 copies in the top 8.
I know from personal experience that that deck was everywhere that year because it was so great.
This is the most polished the red deck had ever been. Your turn 1 lineup was Jackal Pup, Mog Fanatic, and Goblin Vandal. You'd follow that up on turn 2 with Mog Flunkies or Iron Claw Orcs, or 2 1-drops. How Iron Claw Orcs is still used here as anything else in a bookmark still baffles me. And you'd curve it all up with one of your 4 Bolt Lightning, even playing 4 Lightning Blast.
A lot of luck and some City of Brass action on the opponent's side, you could theoretically turn 3 kill someone.
Turn 3 kills are still generally unheard of in today's Magic.
Most people who talk about the Sligh deck don't go as far back to the Goblins of the Flark, Orcish Librarian times, but think of this.
And I don't want to say that this was the beginning of the end for the red deck, but let's say Urza's block came along and cards became more efficient and Ball Lightning rotated out of the format, and the world was about to end anyways once all the computer programs saw a date that started with a 2 and they'd implode, so why even bother? You did not see a lot of Sligh in those days. People were too busy learning how to pronounce the word blog. But things changed after Y2K.
The year 2000, that is where the name Red Deck Wins comes in. For the first time.
See, the same way today's players yearn for the age of Esper Dragons and Seed Rhino, there was some real Mog Fanatic shaped nostalgia upon the turn of the millennium.
People still hung on to the idea of being successful with an aggressive red deck and basically recreated it. And the original name, Red Deck Wins, was actually abbreviated, because that was cool at the time, to RDW2K.
Magic is very cool.
It was specifically named that because in the year of 2000, you weren't supposed to win with the red deck anymore because the cards had gotten much worse.
Toby's not getting here. The best 1-drops in the deck were Goblin Patrol and Goblin Cadets. Big yikes. But that's okay. This deck was not like the traditional red aggro decks. This deck was, and modern players know this word very well, this deck was
actually a burn deck. It still uses the creatures, but not much more than a modern burn deck nowadays would.
So red turned to its spells, but there was a buzz going around. A new way to approach the game of Magic.
That is about the time where people came up with this philosophy of fire.
Adrian Sullivan is an American Magic player who's mostly known for coming up with this very concept.
Philosophy of fire is basically the concept where you're trying to get damage out of any of your cards, and the cards that do not accomplish this are not working towards your plan.
But that's not where the idea started.
The genesis is actually the other way around, that you could sometimes trade life for cards.
Players realized that if you gain 3 life, you would be up a card if your opponent used 1 piece of cardboard and 1 red mana to, for example, lightning bolt you in the face. But in that light bulb over the head moment, Adrian Sullivan realized
it also works the other way around. You can just throw away your cards for life. So this deck, for instance, would just, with its horrible creatures, would just attack into, like this is 2001. There were great creatures around, like people were going like Lanovalves into Blastoderm and stuff like that. So this deck would just attack with its very weak looking creatures into way better creatures, throw away cards, but deal those damage that in the end it would just then rip key to fire and burn the opponent out.
The way of thinking like through this philosophy of fire is this lightning bolt on the creature gonna be worth more than the 3 damage to the opponent? Because your deck is built in a way where you need 7 cards to win the game if each one of them deals 3 damage. So every time you deal less damage, you're losing a card. You're basically mulliganing.
But the burst of red decks, armed with the newfound philosophy of fire, did not last very long. Red deck wins simply seems to have phased out for almost a decade.
And that obviously changed everything about red decks. It was no longer neither Sligh, nor Dead Guy Red, nor red deck wins. Then it was just goblins, which is a completely different animal because it's no longer this mix of creatures and burn spells.
Outside of a random blip of Scred Red in 2008, but that deck played 5 drops, so same color, different flag. We did not really see any real mono red decks for a while. Had it just gone? You kind of have forgotten Javier already. Speaking of forgetting, we have not forgotten Goblin Guide and its bedfellow Grim Lavamancer, but if you think of Magic at the time, you think...
I think they're calling it the Caw Blade now, by the way.
Caw Blade.
He led off with a Delver. Matthew Costa also led off with a Delver.
In a shocking turn of events, I'm going with the Jun deck. Designed by Reed Duke.
Pierre Dajon playing Mono Blue Devotion, and on the right, Jeremy Desani, also of France, also Mono Blue Devotion.
Red was always there, but there was always a bigger fish that had eaten a smaller fish, that had eaten a smaller fish, that had gobbled up the red deck. But there's something about the decks in mid-2015 that just hits somewhat differently. Oh, now we're getting into the golden age of Standard.
Joel Larsson's mono red deck from PT Origins was actually very interesting. Keep in mind that back in the day, in that format, Siege Rhino was all over the place.
People saw Siege Rhino and thought, bye-bye aggro, there's no way an aggressive deck can survive a few removal spells that curve into this thing. It has 5 toughness, it gains you life, and it ends the game quickly. When Magic Origins came along, people turned to the artifact-based Scissor deck thinking maybe an indestructible 5/5 can make it through the hulky menace, but no! 3 mono red decks made it to that Pro Tour top 8. A part of the secret sauce of Larsson's deck was that his 1-drops could sometimes make it up to the size of the Rhino itself. They would do this either with prowess or by being able to pump themselves with mana. And good thing you all had stuff to do with his mana, because look at his mana base. It's just 21 basic mountains.
That's very different from the like newer red decks that played like 24, 25, like also with a lot of utility lands or whatever. Instead, to avoid getting mana screwed very often, this deck relied on having like super cheap mana curve, and on the other side, to avoid mana flooding, it used these pump creatures and also cards like Abbot of the Kettle Keep.
If you look closely at one of these pump creatures, but then also squint and forget some of the text, it might remind you of our old favorite. But don't let your nostalgia for Jackal Pup get in the way of your clear thinking. The thing about Fire Drinker Satyr in this metagame is...
It is a card that actually was very weak in the mirror match. So having your Satyr deal 5 damage to you or 3 to you in the mirror match was not a good idea, and that's why it only played 3 copies, even though in some situations the card was just great. Another reason for this deck being so strong back in the day was Stoke the Flames.
And he's going to find Stoke the Flames, Eric. What do you make of this?
Probably the most efficient burn spells we've had in Standard after Lightning Bolt.
If you cast all your early creatures and could not attack into a big blocker, you could just maybe tap your lands and play other creatures and then pay 0 for your Stoke the Flames. 4 damage, 0 mana. That rate is usually only reserved for Legacy. I'm stoked.
Larsson's deck is a mono red deck built to deal some damage with the creatures and then finish the game with the spells on the stack. The idea is to deal some damage with the early drops, and once your opponent is at 10 life, you will display burn spells until they lose the game. That's why most of these burn spells deal damage to the players.
You can tell that Javier likes this deck because the very next Pro Tour, he came in 9th place with a list that shared many of the cards.
Atarka Red and the Origins Stoke the Flames Red work differently, even though they do share some cards.
Because the point wasn't to do the same thing. The pointy Absent 4/5 was still around, but the mana bases were good, and people were getting greedy with their colors.
Once the rotation happened, the Battle for Syndicate PT was full of mid-range / control-ish piles, like 3 or 4 color decks, which are like Siege Rhino with blue, Mantis Rider with black, or different slow decks that were like foiled by veterans and dual lands, like Cinderglade type of lands.
The main way this deck would differ from Yoel's is that it was meant to go right under a Siege Rhino, and would do this using solely the battlefield.
Instead of playing these burn spells, this deck played combat tricks. Combat tricks are like battlefield spells. Those spells were Titan Strength, Become Immense, and Timur Battle Rage. This will lead into sort of a combo finish situation where you had an aggro deck that suddenly could kill an opponent on 20 lives if they were ever to tap out.
Haha, because this deck comes with a twist. It straddles the line between aggro and combo. In almost any case, casting Become Immense and Timur Battle Rage on a Monastery Swiftspear simply won you the game on the spot.
But you needed your creature to survive through all the combat step. right? And that's something this deck was trying to accomplish by playing enough creatures that demanded removal.
But like against a combo deck, people had to constantly keep mana up to use a counter spell or a removal spell or bluff that they even had one.
Very similar to the Splinter Twin situation, where they will have to go for suboptimal lines again and again, so they wouldn't tap out, they will just put the shields off.
And I can do that with 4 mana, so and no board. And in this format, 18 is usually enough because there's so many fetch lands.
Yeah, I cracked 2 fetch lands. I forgot about it.
A common situation for that metagame was having this deck against an empty board, having the combo in your hand, and your opponent couldn't play something like a Siege Rhino, because if they would tap out, even if it was for like a strong creature, they would decide to the combo.
Bang! And that's going to do it. Javier Dominguez is going to defeat Brandon Burton here and put himself in a really good position for top 8.
Javier unfortunately did not top 8 this tournament.
For me, Pro Tour Battle of Zendikar was a bittersweet one because I got 9th, like breakers. There was also like a very small difference.
And if you saw the title of this video and are now thinking, this deck's pretty good, but that title is just clickbait, this is the part where we talk about the red deck. We are entering the era of Magic where Mono Red earned the title Red Deck Wins.
A Braid takes care of Rishkar, a swing with the 2 menace creatures. There are no blockers, and then he'll shock for the last 2 points.
He is going to be able to, at least in principle, do something on this board here, but finally the exert coming from that Encore Crash.
And he can kill the Glorybringer, he's got the Shard's Defeat, but Hazored is just going to keep hitting Owen, and there's not much he can do about it right now.
Mono Red decks in Standard traditionally are not exactly the deck to beat. What often happens is there is a strong deck that's often full of good cards, and metagames try to adapt to beat those cards.
Mono Red usually shines in as an underdog. The only way to beat the most powerful pile of cards is sometimes just to go under it, which is why it's often the 2nd or 3rd best deck in a format.
Well, Ramuna Red simply changed that paradigm.
Follow me to Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. Everyone went into that tournament knowing Mono Red was the best deck. If you were not playing Mono Red, you were playing a deck angle to beat it. And if you were playing Mono Red, your deck would be tuned specifically for the mirror match.
We thought that Mono Red was the best deck, but I didn't like some of its matchups that they're the more popular decks, and I thought Zombies is a great Mono Red matchup.
Everyone was ready for it, and it still won. More than half the top 8 was Mono Red players. I watched that Pro Tour, and it was just red mirror, and then red mirror, and then red mirror. It's like I angered some Greek gods and they punished me with some weird and cruel blight where now every game of Magic was just Mono Red versus Mono Red.
There are a lot of reasons for this deck to be as good as it was. First of all, the mana base, 24 lands with virtually 10 spell lands. Ramuna Bruins was actually sort of a free burn spells. 24 land decks are often way more stable than decks that have like 20 mountains, 21. The more lands you have, the less you're gonna man screw, right? And that means less mulligans.
And what do you do with your mountains? You cast turn 1 Bombat Courier. If you're not looking close enough, this can fool you into thinking it's Ancestral Recall.
It looks like a 1/1 haste that sometimes is gonna draw a card here and there, but in reality, this deck was so good at applying pressure. You will see games where Bombat will just draw like 5 cards or whatever. Like that will be a game that Bombat won by itself. Having this kind of power on a 1-drop that attacks for 1 on turn 1 with haste was extremely good in Standard.
And you could follow that up with Ragavan's Mommy Carry Zev, or a card that was a sleeper at first, Earthshaker Kenra.
I remember Kenra impressing me particularly back in the day. Like, it was not only a 2-mana, 2-power haste that removed the blocker for a turn, but also the Eternalized part just ended so many games. Like, between the Ramuna Bruins type of card and the Eternalized here with Kenra, this deck was very good at ending games without like being able to block it. It didn't work exactly as the stack finish that the Origins deck had, but it was similar enough considering it was free in terms of deck building.
But those cards just make it a solid deck. The reason this is the red deck is the 4-drops. The meat of this sandwich was Chandra Torch of Defiance and Hazored the Fervent. It's not for nothing that this deck was often called Hazored.
First of all, these cards were very hard to look with, both.
Chandra's a planeswalker and Hazored's an indestructible god.
And these cards were like format defining. They were so strong that they kept being strong for as long as they were legal.
Javier has big titles now, but this tournament was a bittersweet finish for him.
PTR Devastation for me was another 9th place. It's always rough, like it felt like so close yet so far. Back in the day, I had no PT top 8, and it was like a personal goal for me. Felt like it was impossible for me to reach it because every time I was close, I would just get 9th, and I honestly felt like I will never get there.
But he did not give up on the red deck.
It's funny how the deck I took to Worlds in 2017 after rotation was almost the same deck as the Ramuna Red before rotation. Most of the cards were the same. Speaks a little bit of how strong the show was.
And that's going to do it. Javier Dominguez wins the match 2-1, improves to 8-5, and keeps himself right in the thick of it for top 4.
So Wizards of the Coast in one fell swoop decided to clear up the metagame a little. Energy was a mistake, so they put Rogue Refiner and Attune with Ether in cardboard jail. They banned Ramunap Runes, the namesake of the deck, and then also Rampaging Ferocidon?
One of the weirdest bans in Standard were because the card was like not even very good. It was like a fringe cyber card that you played because your cyber was not great. Dominaria came, and with Dominaria came the Goblin Chain Whirler. And the joke was that Goblin Chain Whirler just banned all the 1 creatures out of the format.
Now, most of the cards from last Standard were still around, and not that there's anything wrong with Crop Crasher, the card it obviously replaced, but have you seen Goblin Chain Whirler?
I think that card just put the archetype over the top again.
So Pro Tour Dominaria was won by Wyatt Darby playing Mono Red. Am I surprised Mono Red won? No, there's only one deck in that top 8 that wasn't a Chain Whirler deck. And if the deck wasn't strong enough at that point, players came up with the technology of splashing a teeny tiny bit of black mana for Scrap Heap Scrounger's ability and some duresses in the sideboard.
And that made this deck the best deck in the format for the whole format. Like, until the format rotated, there was not a point where black-red midrange Marn Red / black was not the best deck.
Oh, wait, is the Karizev not attacked? Oh, he can't attack with the Karizev because of the Rampaging Ferocidon on the battlefield.
That's right, he can't do it. And there we go. Jensen fires off a Magma Spray, which changes the math back in his direction. And Jensen...
Javier lost in the finals of the World Championship in 2017, so he went into Worlds the following year with one goal in mind: finding a way to beat the Rakdos deck and take home the title of World Champion.
I remember just trying to beat this deck, just building decks trying to beat this archetype, and it was impossible for me. Like, I just couldn't build a deck that was ahead against this archetype. And that's something that's extremely rare in Standard. And when it happens, decks tend to get banned.
So if you can't beat them, join them. When tuning the red deck, splashing black for legal reason, to win this tournament, Javier learned an important deck building lesson that has stayed with him to this day.
The big thing we learned as Magic deck builders from this deck was how to actually split different cards that are playing similar roles, but that sometimes play differently. Namely, we have this Reckoning Phoenix, Hazored, Chandra, and Karn Sign of Ursa in the same 4 mana slots.
Now there's a limit of 4 mana cards you can play in the same deck, and you usually play whichever ones are better than the others. So if Hazored and Chandra are better, you play 4 of each and call it a day. But Javier and his testing partners decided to go for 2 Hazords, 2 Rekindling Phoenixes, 2 Chandra, and only 1 Karn, when other lists at the time were playing more Phoenixes.
Speaking of which, by the way, Rekindling Phoenix is another card that got sort of overlooked on the spoiler seasons. Not because it looked bad, but because how much Hazored and Chandra looked on surface. However, what we players missed a little bit there was how Phoenix actually did match up against Hazored and Chandra. And this deck was a dominant that being a card that's good in the mirror match and also good in multiples, led it into often being a 4-off or a 3-off.
So let's break down what Javier did. In a world where red deck is best deck and you have too many big hitters to play in the same slot of the famous mana curve Sligh invented, it's easy to go all in and either play 4 Hazored and 4 Chandra, or decide to counter the red decks and go for 4 Phoenixes. But Javier decided to split all the cards evenly because they were all good in different situations.
Phoenix was better when you were behind, when you were losing, in situations where Chandra will just come into play and die, even though everyone will agree Chandra was a better card. And that's something I have used later again and again.
But let's keep in mind that cases like this are rare. You seldomly get to tune a deck this much before it gets trumped by the next big thing.
As a community, as a hive mind, deck builders had a lot of time to actually tune this deck. Like, there were a lot of tournaments where this deck was a deck to beat, and people will try to make it better again and again. Like, great players will try this every tournament.
You don't usually get decks that are this refined. The list Javier played at this point was probably the perfect combination of the cards available you could bring to this tournament. This deck took 2 years to perfect.
You give a player like that such powerful cards.
It's funny because it goes the other way around, right? It also means that people had 2 years to try to find a way to beat the deck, and they didn't.
Yeah, exactly. In order to see how much time people had to build this deck, we can just compare it with like the lifespan standard decks often have. But this one was there for like almost 2 years, the same shell. So people had a lot of time. All the decks are often tuned in 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Like when a standard deck is there for like six months, it feels like it's perfectly tuned already and it's been there forever. We see it like in legacy decks or even modern decks where a deck is like so well tuned that it's much better than it probably should be because how well it is built. Well, this deck in a standard, in my opinion, it really benefited of that effect.
Do you think this is the best red deck ever?
I think that this is clearly the best red deck ever in context of the metagame. Like, red decks rarely were like the decks to beat, but here it was not only the deck to beat for a while, but also it just stayed like that. Like at the end of the format, it just could not be beaten. Like it just was that strong. And obviously for me, I mean, it was a special deck. I still keep it because I won Worlds with it.
And yes, you beautiful nerds, this story is a happy ending because Javier's efforts were not for naught as he ended up beating, to no one's surprise, another red deck in the finals, making Javier 2018's world champion, playing his favorite cards.
Right there, but at any rate, he's getting in, he's putting Gregor Kowalski.
Is he down to 2 here? Well, maybe
down
the numbers are
3, and that's going to do it. Sweet redemption for Javier.
It also had Hazored, which is one of my favorite cards. It's not a coincidence, a Fervent Champion, the card they put me on. It's named the Fervent Champion as Hazored the Fervent.
Oh, yes, the card. Javier doesn't just happen to have some random painting of himself riding a horse in his house. That's the art of a card Wizards of the Coast designed for him to commemorate his victory.
Yeah, for the card, I did love that it was a red creature. Like, my success just came with red decks. It came with aggressive, Bomat, and Hazored type of decks, so I loved, like, it was a red small creature. I did not design it, but I actually liked how it ended showing up, you know, in the battlefield attacking for 1 with haste.
A fun fact is that Javier never registered his own card at any competitive tournament while it was legal and standard. If you look at the card, you can see Javier actually holding up his invitational trophy like it's a sword. And even if he did not swing it himself, Seth Manfield did channel some Javier Red aggression when he brought the card to the top 8 of Worlds in 2020, playing our deck of the hour, Mono Red. So that was the most oppressive red deck ever. Mono Red is usually the underdog, the deck that beats the best deck. People make fun of the red deck. But if you look at the top 8s of all standard events of all time, it's by far the most successful, sitting at 7% of the winner's share, whilst the next best are 5 at 3. That's because there's only more casual players who play it, you say? Okay, sure. If you look at the top 8 of all Pro Tours ever, it's tied at first place with Golgari Aggro, each at 6% share of the metagame of all time. So let's check at the top of the top, the World Championships. What do the best players in the world win with? 10% of the top brackets of the World Championships are Mono Red Aggro decks. Esper and Dimir Aggro trail behind at 5% each. The red deck wins.
I never thought about it before, but it does make a lot of sense that Mono Red is the best standard deck ever. The reason why is because it has always been there, and I think the huge thing that makes the difference is it's been there forever. Like, I'm pretty sure you can find a Mono Red decent standard deck in most seasons, like every 2 years at least one. But you will probably not find an absent one.
Yeah, it may not be the best deck, but it's certainly the easiest deck to assemble a well-working version of from basically any card pool. I mean, we saw the Tempest only constructed format.
What I think these way better MTG players than I am are trying to say is that there's 5 colors of Magic, and you usually want to use as many of them as you can. Each color has their own identity, and Fire, the pure passion and aggression, the all balls against the wall attitude of Red is the one that survives the best on its own.
They tend to be different colors, they tend to change, but Mono Red just was there at the early days, and it's there right now, and it's just been around. So I think it does make a lot of sense, and honestly, you know, in this fact, it made me smile. So.
People underestimate the red deck.
Mono Red is rarely the best deck, but it's very often a very good deck.
A handful of basic mountains and whatever commons you find in the draft leftovers that attack for 2.
It's a deck you have to consider going to a tournament, but it's often not the deck you have to beat. And you have to dance between these cyber slots where, do I play this card against Mono Red, or do I play this card against whatever mid-range pile is good right now? And when you do choose the beating the mid-range pile route, well, sometimes you get punished by Mono Red. And that's been happening in Magic history again and again, and that's one of the secrets for Mono Red being so good in Standard.
So is the Mono Red deck the best deck ever? I don't know. Red players don't ask questions. They just attack and let their opponents decide.